The rugged hills of Northern California hold ancient powers beneath their wind-swept ridges. Some are whispered in the sacred songs of the Modoc people, others carved into the volcanic rock by spirits long forgotten, and a few, the most transformative, kind, are awakened only when two worlds collide in moments of desperate need. But for Dr. Catherine Brennan, these hills had always been a place of scientific study rather than spiritual mystery, until that fog-shrouded morning in October 1872, when fate delivered a dying warrior to her doorstep and forever changed her understanding of what it truly meant to heal. The Northern California Medical Outpost stood like a lone sentinel against the vast wilderness that stretched between the settlements of Eureka and the volcanic peaks of the Cascade Range. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Catherine Brennan had established this remote facility 3 years earlier, with a purpose that most of her colleagues considered both admirable and foolish: to provide medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay, their social standing, or the color of their skin. At 31, Catherine possessed a combination of medical brilliance and stubborn idealism that had already earned her both acclaim and controversy in the medical circles of San Francisco. She had graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania with honors that couldn't be ignored, even by the male-dominated medical establishment of the West Coast. Her surgical skills were exceptional, her diagnostic abilities uncanny, and her dedication to patient care absolute. But her insistence on treating Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and other marginalized populations had made her persona non grata at the prestigious hospitals where her talents should have flourished. Catherine's journey to this remote outpost had been forged by tragedy and tempered by determination. Born in Boston to Irish immigrants who had fled the potato famine, she had witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of medical discrimination when her younger brother Timothy died of pneumonia because no respectable hospital would treat the son of Irish laborers. That experience, seared into her memory at age 14, had driven her relentless pursuit of medical education and her unwavering commitment to treating all patients equally. Her father, Patrick Brennan, had worked 16-hour days in the shipyards to pay for her education, believing that his brilliant daughter could achieve what he never could: respect in American society. Her mother, Bridget, had sacrificed her own dreams to support Catherine's studies, teaching her the herbal remedies and folk medicine that had been passed down through generations of Irish women. These dual influences, rigorous scientific training, and traditional healing wisdom, had shaped Catherine into a physician unlike any other of her era. The outpost itself was a marvel of practical design and medical innovation. Catherine had spent months surveying the region before selecting this location, a natural clearing surrounded by protective hills, with access to fresh water from a spring that never ran dry, and positioned along the ancient trails that connected various tribal territories with the growing settlements to the south. The building she constructed was part medical clinic, part surgical theater, and part fortress against the harsh weather that could isolate the region for weeks at a time. Her medical equipment represented the finest available technology of the era: surgical instruments imported from Germany, pharmaceutical supplies from the most reputable manufacturers in New York and Boston, and even some experimental devices that she had designed herself to address the unique challenges of frontier medicine. The facility included a fully equipped operating theater with gas lighting that allowed for night surgeries, a recovery ward with 6 beds arranged for optimal patient monitoring, a pharmacy stocked with both traditional medicines and innovative treatments, and living quarters that allowed Catherine to remain on site continuously. The pharmacy itself was a testament to Catherine's comprehensive approach to healing. Alongside bottles of morphine, chloroform, and other conventional medications stood jars filled with herbs she had learned to identify and use from various sources: willow bark for pain relief, digitalis for heart conditions, cinchona bark for fevers, and dozens of other plant-based remedies that had proven their worth through centuries of use by indigenous peoples. Catherine's daily routine reflected her methodical approach to both medicine and life. She rose before dawn to check on any patients who might be recovering from procedures, reviewed her supplies and equipment, and then spent the morning hours studying medical journals and corresponding with colleagues across the country. Her correspondence was voluminous and far-reaching. She maintained professional relationships with physicians in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and even London, sharing case studies and medical innovations that might benefit patients regardless of where they were treated. Her afternoons were dedicated to patient consultations, either with individuals who had made the difficult journey to reach her facility or through house calls to settlements and camps within a day's ride of the outpost. These journeys often took her through some of the most dangerous territory in Northern California, where tensions between white settlers and Native American tribes had created a landscape of mutual suspicion and violence. The diversity of her patients would have shocked most physicians of the era. Wealthy ranchers seeking treatment for injuries or illnesses they preferred to keep private traveled alongside impoverished miners suffering from occupational diseases. Chinese railroad workers brought their families for medical care they couldn't receive elsewhere due to racial prejudice. Mexican vaqueros, wounded in cattle drives or range disputes, knew they could find treatment without questions or judgment. Most significantly, members of various Native American tribes had begun seeking her services, drawn by her reputation for treating all patients with equal respect and her growing knowledge of traditional healing practices. Catherine's interest in Native American medicine had begun as professional curiosity, but had evolved into genuine respect for therapeutic approaches that often proved remarkably effective. She had established relationships with several tribal healers who were willing to share their knowledge in exchange for access to Western medical techniques that could complement their traditional practices. These exchanges had expanded Catherine's understanding of medicine beyond the rigid boundaries of her formal education, and had made her outpost a unique bridge between two very different healing traditions. One of her most important relationships was with Winema, a Modoc woman who served as both translator and cultural mediator for tribal members seeking medical care. Winema had married a white settler but maintained strong connections to her people, and she had become instrumental in helping Catherine understand not just the medical needs of Native American patients, but the cultural context that influenced their approach to healing and disease. Through Winema, Catherine had learned that the Modoc people possessed sophisticated knowledge of herbal medicine, surgical techniques for treating wounds, and psychological approaches to healing that addressed the spiritual as well as physical aspects of illness. She had observed Modoc healers perform procedures that achieved results comparable to her own surgical interventions, using tools and techniques that had been refined over generations of practice. The political situation in Northern California during the early 1870s was extraordinarily volatile. The Modoc War had been building for years, fueled by conflicts over land rights, broken treaties, and the federal government's attempts to force the Modoc people onto reservations far from their ancestral homeland. Captain Jack, known to his people as Kintpuash, had emerged as the most formidable leader of Modoc resistance, combining military genius with diplomatic skill in ways that had frustrated and impressed federal commanders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Catherine tried to remain neutral in these political conflicts, focusing on her medical mission rather than taking sides in disputes that seemed to have no clear resolution. But neutrality became increasingly difficult as violence escalated, and both sides demanded demonstrations of loyalty from anyone in the region. Federal authorities viewed her treatment of Native American patients with suspicion, while some tribal leaders questioned whether any white person could truly be trusted during a time of war. The morning of October 15, 1872, began with an unusual atmospheric disturbance that would later seem prophetic. Thick fog had rolled in from the Pacific, creating an otherworldly landscape where familiar landmarks disappeared into grey obscurity. Catherine had experienced many such mornings during her years at the outpost, but this fog felt different, heavier, more charged with electricity, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of some significant event. She was preparing her morning rounds when the sound reached her, hoofbeats approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Through the fog, Catherine could make out the shapes of multiple horses, but something was wrong with the rhythm of their movement. Some horses were riderless, and others carried riders who swayed unsteadily in their saddles, suggesting injury or exhaustion. As the group emerged from the fog into the clearing around her outpost, Catherine immediately recognized the signs of a military engagement gone terribly wrong. 3 Modoc warriors, all bearing wounds of varying severity, supported between them a 4th man whose condition appeared critical. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages, his breathing was labored and irregular, and his level of consciousness fluctuated between brief moments of awareness and concerning periods of unresponsiveness. The warriors who had brought him were themselves in need of medical attention, but their focus remained entirely on their injured leader. Catherine could see in their eyes the desperate hope that had driven them to seek help from someone they would normally consider an enemy, a white doctor whose people had been at war with theirs for decades. The most severely injured man was, clearly, someone of great importance within the Modoc community. His clothing, though now torn and blood-stained, showed the intricate beadwork and craftsmanship that marked high status. More significantly, the deference shown to him by the other warriors, even in his unconscious state, indicated that he held a position of considerable authority and respect. Catherine noticed details that spoke to his rank. A silver armband that caught the morning light, eagle feathers woven into his long black hair, and a medicine bag that remained clutched in his hand despite his unconscious state. Catherine's medical training took over immediately, overriding any concerns about the political implications of treating wounded Modoc warriors. She quickly assessed the situation, noting that the leader's injuries included what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds, one high in the chest that had missed vital organs by inches, another in his left shoulder that had shattered bone, and a third that had grazed his skull, leaving him concussed and disoriented when conscious. The amount of blood loss was severe, and without immediate surgical intervention, he would certainly die within hours. The other warriors had sustained wounds that were serious but not immediately life-threatening, cuts from cavalry sabers, minor, gunshot wounds, and the kind of injuries consistent with a fighting retreat against superior firepower. One warrior had an arrow wound in his thigh that appeared to be from friendly fire during the confusion of battle. Another showed signs of a severe concussion from a rifle butt to the head. The third, though wounded in the arm, remained alert and seemed to be the designated spokesman for the group. Without hesitation, Catherine began organizing the most complex medical emergency she had ever faced at the outpost. She directed the warriors to carry their leader into her surgical theater while she rapidly assembled the instruments and supplies needed for major trauma surgery. Her movements were swift but precise, driven by the knowledge that every minute of delay decreased the chances of successful treatment. The challenge before her was unprecedented in her medical career. She would be operating on a Modoc war leader, while his armed warriors waited outside her surgical theater, knowing that failure might result not only in the death of her patient, but potentially in violent retaliation against herself. Moreover, the political ramifications of her actions could be enormous. Treating wounded enemy combatants during an active military conflict could be viewed as treason by federal authorities. But Catherine had established her outpost on the principle that medical need transcended political boundaries, and she had never wavered from that commitment, regardless of the personal costs involved. Her medical oath had been sacred to her since the day she graduated, and she had never allowed political considerations to influence her treatment decisions. As she prepared to begin the most important surgery of her career, she was acutely aware that the next few hours would determine not only whether her patient lived or died, but whether her own life's work would continue or be destroyed by the consequences of her choices. The Modoc leader regained consciousness briefly as Catherine began her examination, his dark eyes focusing on her face with startling intensity despite his critical condition. When he spoke, his voice was weak but carried unmistakable authority, and his words, delivered in accented English, would haunt Catherine for years to come. "White medicine woman, if you save Kintpuash, the Modoc people will remember. If you let Kintpuash die, they will also remember." Catherine met his gaze directly, recognizing in that moment that she was treating not just any wounded warrior, but Kintpuash himself, the legendary Modoc leader known to white settlers as Captain Jack, whose military genius and fierce resistance had made him one of the most feared and respected Native American leaders in the entire Pacific Northwest. The realization that she held the life of such a historically significant figure in her hands was both terrifying and deeply humbling. Kintpuash had achieved legendary status through his strategic brilliance in warfare and his unwavering commitment to protecting his people's rights to their ancestral homeland. Federal commanders had grudgingly admitted that he was one of the most formidable military tacticians they had ever faced, capable of outmaneuvering forces many times larger than his own band of warriors. His reputation extended far beyond military circles. Even his enemies acknowledged his intelligence, dignity, and principled leadership of his people during impossibly difficult circumstances. As Kintpuash lost consciousness again, slipping back into the critical state that threatened his life, Catherine began the surgical procedures that would either save one of the most important Native American leaders of the era or result in her own likely death at the hands of his warriors. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows of her surgical theater like a living entity, as if the spirits of the land themselves were watching to see whether the white medicine woman could bridge the deadly gap between two worlds at war. The surgery that followed would test every aspect of Catherine's medical training, her improvisational skills, and her ability to work under pressure that went far beyond anything she had experienced in the hospitals of San Francisco. But more than her medical abilities were at stake. The success or failure of the next few hours would determine whether she would be remembered as a healer who transcended the bitter divisions of her time, or as another casualty of the seemingly endless conflict between white settlers and the Native American peoples whose land they had claimed. As Catherine made her first incision, beginning the delicate work of saving Kintpuash's life, she had no way of knowing that her actions would soon elevate her to a status within Modoc culture that no white person had ever achieved, or that the consequences of this foggy morning would forever alter her understanding of what it meant to be a healer in a world torn apart by hatred and violence. The surgical theater at Catherine's outpost had never witnessed anything approaching. The complexity of the operation that began at dawn on October 15th, 1872, as she worked to save Kintpuash's life, the legendary Modoc leader lay unconscious on her operating table, while 3 armed warriors maintained their vigil just outside her door, their presence a constant reminder that failure would likely mean her own death. Catherine's hands moved with practiced precision as she assessed the full extent of Kintpuash's injuries under proper lighting. The gunshot wound to his chest had been caused by a large caliber rifle, probably a Springfield used by cavalry forces. The bullet had entered just below his left collarbone, tracked through muscle and tissue, and lodged against his shoulder blade without penetrating vital organs. A stroke of fortune that had probably saved his life during the fighting retreat. That brought him to her door. The shoulder wound presented a more complex challenge. The bullet had shattered his clavicle and torn through the network of nerves and blood vessels that supplied his left arm. Without careful reconstruction of these damaged structures, Kintpuash would face permanent disability that could end his effectiveness as a military leader. For a warrior whose people depended on his physical capabilities as much as his strategic mind, such an outcome might be worse than death. Most concerning was the head wound, not the grazing bullet that had left a bloody furrow across his scalp, but the signs of severe concussion that suggested he had been knocked unconscious by the blast from an exploding artillery shell. Catherine had seen similar injuries in patients who had survived building collapses or mine explosions, and she knew that the next few hours would be critical in determining whether permanent brain damage had occurred. As Catherine began the painstaking work of extracting the bullets and repairing damaged tissue, she became acutely aware of sounds from outside her surgical theater. The three Modoc warriors were not simply waiting passively. They were engaged in what appeared to be a spiritual ceremony, chanting in low voices and burning aromatic herbs that filled the air with unfamiliar but somehow comforting scents. The lead warrior, who had introduced himself as Bogus Charlie through a mixture of English and sign language, had positioned himself closest to the surgical theater door. Despite his own wounds, a cavalry saber cut across his ribs and a bullet graze on his thigh, he remained alert and watchful, ready to defend his leader even in this most unlikely sanctuary. His eyes constantly moved between the surgical theater and the surrounding landscape, watching for any sign of pursuing cavalry forces. Rough hands dragged her away from the burning building as consciousness faded in and out like a flickering candle. She felt rather than saw the knife that opened a long gash across her ribs, designed to ensure she would bleed out slowly rather than recovering to tell tales. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the sound of her life's work being consumed by flames, and Steele's final words echoing in her ears. Such a waste of potential. She could have been useful if she'd been more reasonable about progress. When Sarah finally stirred to consciousness, the false dawn was painting the eastern sky in shades of grey and pink. The trading post was nothing but smoking ruins, and vultures were already circling overhead, drawn by the scent of death and destruction. Every breath brought agony from her injured ribs, and her head throbbed with each heartbeat. But she was alive. As she struggled to sit up, Sarah's hand found the leather pouch her father had given her years earlier, still hanging around her neck despite everything she had endured. Inside were the sacred items of her Sioux heritage, including a small medicine bundle that her grandmother had prepared for protection during dangerous journeys. The bundle had been blessed by the tribal shamans and was supposed to guard against death by violence. Perhaps there was more truth to the old ways than she had ever fully believed. As Sarah Whitefeather pulled herself to her feet among the ashes of her former life, something fundamental had changed within her. The young woman who had tried to build bridges between worlds was gone, burned away in the flames of betrayal and greed. What remained was something harder and more dangerous, someone who carried the blood of warriors and the rage of the dispossessed. Steele and his associates had made their fatal mistake when they underestimated not just her resilience, but the bonds of family and honor that connected her to the most formidable military force on the Great Plains. Her brother Thunderhorse commanded the loyalty of thousands of warriors across 7 tribes, men who had never been defeated in battle and who considered an attack on family to be an attack on their sacred honor. The war they had started by burning. Her trading post would not end until justice had been served. Plains justice, swift and absolute and without mercy for those who had shown none to others. 3 days after the attack, Sarah Whitefeather dragged herself through the tall prairie grass like a wounded animal seeking refuge. The knife wound across her ribs had stopped bleeding, but infection was setting in, turning her skin hot and feverish. Every step sent lightning bolts of pain through her damaged body, yet she pressed forward with the grim determination of someone who understood that stopping meant death. The Missouri River stretched before her like a silver ribbon in the morning. Light, its muddy waters carrying the promise of salvation. If she could reach the tribal fishing camps her brother's people maintained 20 miles downstream. But 20 miles might as well have been 1,000 for someone in her condition. Her legs trembled with each step, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision, warning signs that her body was approaching its limits. Sarah collapsed behind, a fallen cottonwood log, gasping for breath as she tried to assess her situation rationally. The fever was getting worse, clouding her judgment and making it difficult to think clearly. She needed shelter, clean water, and medicine, none of which were available in this empty stretch of prairie. Worse yet, Steele's men might still be hunting for her, ensuring their work was complete. As she struggled to rise, Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of a meadowlark, but something about the call was wrong. The pattern was too regular, too purposeful to be natural. Her father had taught her to recognize such signals years ago, the secret communications used by hunters and warriors to coordinate their movements without alerting their prey. Someone was out there, moving through the grass with deliberate stealth. Sarah drew her father's revolver with trembling hands, the weight of the weapon almost too much for her weakened grip. Through the tall grass, she caught glimpses of movement, 3 figures advancing in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military training. These weren't random bandits or opportunistic scavengers. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of men following specific orders. The first man emerged from the grass 30 yards away, and Sarah's heart sank as she recognized him. Garrett, Steele's lean killer, the one who had been assigned to finish her inside the trading post. His clothes were singed, and his left arm hung awkwardly, suggesting he had been caught in the fire when the roof collapsed. But he was very much alive, and clearly intent on completing his original mission. Found blood trail leading this direction. Garrett called to his companions, his voice carrying easily across the still morning air. "She's wounded bad, can't have gotten far." He cradled a rifle in his good arm, sweeping the weapon back and forth as he searched for signs of his quarry. The second man who appeared was younger, probably in his early 20s, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself, worthy of riding with killers. "Maybe the wolves got her already," he suggested hopefully. "Been hearing howls all night." Garrett's cold laugh dispelled that optimism. "Wolves don't clean up loose ends, boy. She's alive until I see the body, and probably talking to whoever will listen about what happened at that trading post." "I can't have that." Sarah pressed herself lower behind the log, fighting waves of dizziness as she tried to formulate a plan. 3 armed men against 1 wounded woman were impossible odds, but she had advantages they might not expect. This was her country, land she had traveled since childhood, and she knew every creek, ravine, and hiding place for miles around. More importantly, she carried something they couldn't anticipate or understand. As her fingers found the medicine bundle around her neck, Sarah felt a strange calm descend over her fevered mind. The sacred items within had been blessed by old tribal shamans, men who understood the spirit world in ways that white men never could. Her grandmother had told her stories of warriors who drew strength from such bundles, fighting beyond normal human limitations when protecting their people. The third hunter materialized from a different direction, flanking her position, with practiced precision. This one was older, scarred by decades of violence, and he moved with the careful attention of someone who had survived too many battles to take anything for granted. "Fresh tracks here," he announced, pointing to disturbed earth near Sarah's hiding place. "She's close." Sarah made her decision then, abandoning stealth for desperate action. She rose from behind the log like an avenging spirit, her father's revolver barking twice in rapid succession. The young man cried out and fell backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Garrett dove for cover, cursing, as Sarah's third shot kicked up dirt inches from his head, but the effort cost her dearly. The sudden movement tore open her partially healed wound, sending fresh blood streaming down her side. The fever that had been building for days chose that moment to spike, turning the world into a spinning kaleidoscope of pain and confusion. Sarah stumbled, her fourth shot going wild as her knees buckled beneath her. Garrett was on his feet instantly, rushing forward while she was vulnerable. "Should have died quiet like you were supposed to," he snarled, raising his rifle for the killing shot. Sarah tried to bring her revolver to bear, but her hands were shaking too badly to aim effectively. This was how it would end then, not in the glory of battle her ancestors might have chosen, but as a wounded animal hunted down by professional killers. The arrow that sprouted from Garrett's chest came from nowhere, its eagle feather fletching quivering as the steel point found his. Hot. He looked down in surprise, as if unable to believe what had happened, then toppled forward without another sound. The scarred veteran spun toward this new threat, working the lever of his rifle desperately, but two more arrows took him before he could fire a shot. From the tall grass emerged 5 Sioux warriors, their faces painted for war and their weapons held ready for continued battle. Sarah recognized their leader immediately despite her fevered condition. Running Wolf, her brother's lieutenant and closest friend, a man who had earned his name by once running down a cavalry horse during a raid on a supply train. "Sister," Running Wolf said in the Lakota tongue, kneeling beside her with genuine concern, etched on his stern features. "Thunderhorse sent us when your message arrived. We have been searching since the smoke was seen." His English was accented but clear, learned during negotiations with various military commanders over the years. Sarah tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The combination of blood loss, infection, and sheer exhaustion had pushed her body beyond its ability to function. She felt strong arms lifting her, heard urgent voices discussing her condition in rapid Lakota, but consciousness was fading like smoke on the wind. When she next awoke, Sarah found herself in a traditional teepee, its interior fragrant with the smoke of healing herbs. Sunlight filtered through the buffalo hide walls, suggesting she had been unconscious for hours or perhaps even days. An elderly woman sat beside her, grinding medicines in a stone bowl with the practiced movements of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft. "Grandmother," Sarah whispered, using the respectful term for an elder woman among her people. The medicine woman looked up with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of countless winters. "You return to us from the spirit world, child," the old woman replied in Lakota, her voice like dried leaves rustling in autumn wind. "The ancestors chose to send you back, but you must honor their gift by living purposefully." She gestured toward a bowl of bitter-smelling tea. "Drink this. Your body still fights the infection those white men's weapons left in your flesh." Sarah struggled to sit up, accepting the offered medicine despite its harsh taste. As her head cleared, she became aware of sounds outside the teepee, the voices of many people going about their daily business. This was not the small hunting camp she had hoped to reach, but something much larger. "Where am I?" she asked, switching to English as her thoughts organized themselves more clearly. The medicine woman smiled, understanding both languages perfectly. You are in the winter camp of your brother's band, child. 7 tribes have gathered here to hear Thunder Horse speak of the troubles spreading across the land. Your message reached him at the perfect time, when all the war chiefs were already assembled. Through the teepee's entrance flap, Sarah could see portions of the vast encampment stretching along the river valley. Hundreds of lodges dotted the landscape, representing thousands of warriors and their families. Smoke rose from countless cooking fires while children played between the dwellings and horses grazed in carefully guarded herds. She had never seen so many of her people gathered in one place. The attack on your trading post was not an isolated incident, the medicine woman continued, handing Sarah a bowl of rich buffalo stew. Settlers have been burned out across 3 territories. Tribal hunting parties have found armed white men, occupying traditional grounds, shooting anyone who approaches. Something is building, something that threatens all the free peoples of this land. Sarah ate slowly, her appetite returning as the medicine took effect. There was a man called Colonel Steele, she said, describing the leader of her attackers. He spoke of powerful interests and strategic locations. My trading post wasn't random. It was targeted specifically because of its location and my connections to the tribes. The old woman nodded grimly. Running Wolf brought back the bodies of the men who hunted you. We found papers in their possessions, maps marking water sources, river crossings, and tribal winter camps. Someone is gathering information for a campaign of extermination. Before Sarah could respond, the teepee flap was pushed aside and a figure filled the entrance. Thunder Horse stood nearly 7 feet tall, his massive frame draped in traditional war regalia that spoke of countless victories. Eagle feathers adorned his black hair, and war paint marked his stern features in patterns that had terrified enemies across the Great Plains. At 32, he was the youngest man ever to unite multiple Sioux tribes under single leadership, and his reputation for tactical brilliance had made him legendary among both red and white populations. "My sister lives," he said in English, his deep voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "The spirits have answered our prayers and given us the weapon we need to fight this new threat." He knelt beside her with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "Tell me everything about these men who attacked you." Sarah recounted the events at her trading post, describing Steele and his men in detail while her brother listened with the focused attention of a military commander gathering intelligence. She repeated their conversation word for word, knowing that every detail might prove crucial in the battles to come. $50 for a trading post worth 20 times that amount, Thunder Horse mused when she finished. They were not interested in profit, only in removal. Someone wants that river crossing under different control, and they are willing to kill to achieve their goal. "But why?" Sarah asked. "My business served everyone fairly. I never took sides in territorial disputes or provided weapons to any. Action! What threat could I possibly represent?" Thunder Horse exchanged a meaningful glance with the medicine woman before answering. "You represented something more dangerous than weapons, sister. You represented the possibility that our peoples could coexist peacefully, that red and white could trade and prosper together without constant warfare. Such examples interfere with the plans of those who profit from conflict." The implications struck Sarah like a physical blow. Her life's work, everything she had built through years of careful diplomacy and honest dealing, had been destroyed precisely because it was successful. Someone wanted the frontier to remain a place of suspicion and violence, and her trading post had been an obstacle to that goal. "Running Wolf found more than just the men who hunted you," Thunder Horse continued, his expression darkening with controlled fury. "We have been tracking the raiders who burned the other settlements. All are connected to a larger organization, well-funded and professionally equipped. They carry the same type of weapons, use similar tactics, and follow identical patterns of destruction." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her physical condition. "How large an organization?" "Large enough to threaten every independent," Settlement between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains, her brother replied grimly. Large enough to require a coordinated response from all the tribes if we hope to stop them before they achieve their goals. The medicine woman rose and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the teepee, returning with a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Your brother has been planning for this war since the first reports of organized raids reached our ears, she explained, unwrapping the bundle to reveal traditional war regalia sized for a woman. He hoped you would choose to stand with your people when the time came. Sarah stared at the beautifully crafted items, recognizing work that had taken months to complete. A war dress of the finest doeskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her family's victories in battle. A war bonnet with eagle feathers, earned through acts of courage by various ancestors, weapons crafted by master artisans and blessed by the tribal shamans for protection in combat. I am not a warrior, she protested, though her fingers traced the elegant patterns with obvious appreciation. I am a trader, a builder of bridges between peoples. Thunderhorse leaned forward, his eyes burning with the intensity that had made him the most feared war chief on the plains. The time for bridges has passed, sister. These men have declared war on everything we hold sacred. They burn our allies, destroy our friends, and threaten our children's future. Now we must respond in the only language they understand. Sarah looked up at her brother, seeing not just family, but the leader of thousands of warriors who had never known defeat in battle. What do you want me to do? Help us understand our enemy, Thunderhorse replied. You know the white world better than any of our other scouts. You understand their methods of business, their ways of thinking, their weaknesses. We need that knowledge if we are to defeat them decisively. The medicine woman placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. But first, you must heal completely. The spirit saved your life for a purpose, but that purpose cannot be fulfilled if your body remains weak from your injuries. Over the following days, Sarah's strength returned gradually as the tribal healers worked their ancient magic. She learned that the winter camp contained not just Sioux warriors, but representatives from dozens of other tribes throughout the region. Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and even traditional enemies had sent delegates to discuss the growing threat posed by the organized raiders. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as more information arrived daily. Settlements burned in patterns that suggested careful planning rather than random violence. Tribal hunting grounds occupied by armed men who shot first and never bothered with questions. Trading posts and way stations destroyed with professional efficiency, eliminating the neutral meeting places that had helped maintain peace between different communities. Someone with vast resources and ruthless ambition was systematically destroying the delicate web of relationships that had allowed diverse peoples to coexist in the frontier territories. They were creating a climate of fear and suspicion that would justify increasingly harsh military responses from the territorial government, responses that would ultimately benefit whoever stood to profit from expanded conflict. Sarah spent her recovery time studying the maps and documents that various scouting parties had recovered from their encounters with the raiders. A pattern emerged that chilled her to the bone. Every targeted location controlled access to water, river crossings, or strategic passes through the mountains. Someone was positioning themselves to control all movement and commerce throughout the Northern Territories. It's a land grab, she told Thunderhorse during one of their evening strategy sessions, but not just for farming or ranching. Someone wants to control all the transportation routes, all the natural resources, all the strategic positions that would matter in a larger war. Her brother nodded grimly. The question is, who has the resources and influence to organize such a campaign? This requires coordination between multiple territorial governments, military units, and private armies. Only someone with connections at the highest levels could arrange such cooperation. As Sarah's health improved, so did her understanding of the true scope of the threat they faced. This was not just a local conflict between settlers and natives, but part of a larger scheme that threatened everyone who valued freedom and independence in the Western Territories. The men who had burned her trading post were just foot soldiers in an army whose generals remained hidden in the shadows of power. But they had made one crucial mistake in their careful planning. They had underestimated the bonds of family and honor that connected the scattered tribes of the Great Plains. By attacking Thunder Horse's sister, they had given him the perfect justification to unite his people against a common enemy. The war they had started with fire and treachery would continue with the ancient weapons of the plains, and this time the raiders would face opponents who understood both their methods and their weaknesses. Sarah Whitefeather was no longer just a trader caught in the middle of territorial disputes. She had become something far more dangerous to her enemies, a bridge between two worlds who could help her people fight with both traditional courage and modern tactical understanding. The raiders had tried to silence her voice permanently, but instead they had given her people the motivation and information they needed to fight back effectively. The real war was just beginning. 2 weeks after her rescue, Sarah Whitefeather stood at the edge of the Great Council Circle as representatives from 17 different tribes gathered for the most significant war conference in Plains history. The massive assembly stretched across a natural amphitheater formed by rolling hills, with each tribal delegation arranged according to ancient protocols that had governed inter-tribal relations for centuries. Never before had so many traditional enemies sat together in peace, united by a common threat that transcended old rivalries and territorial disputes. The transformation in Sarah herself was remarkable. Gone was the pale, fevered woman who had nearly died in the prairie grass. Daily training with Running Wolf and other war leaders had restored her strength while building new capabilities she had never possessed before. Her soft trader's hands now bore the calluses of a warrior, skilled with both traditional weapons and the captured rifles taken from Steele's raiders. More importantly, her mind had been sharpened by intensive study of military tactics, turning her natural intelligence toward the deadly art of warfare. Thunder Horse stood at the center of the great circle, his massive presence commanding absolute attention as he addressed the assembled chiefs and war leaders. Sacred pipes circulated among the delegates, binding them together in spiritual as well as military alliance. The smoke carried prayers to the ancestors, seeking guidance for the battles that lay ahead while honoring the sacred nature of their gathering. "Brothers," Thunder Horse began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled thousands, "we have called this council because our people face a threat unlike any in our long history. This is not the familiar warfare of tribe against tribe, or even the conflicts with individual groups of white settlers. What we face now is organized destruction, planned and executed by enemies who seek to eliminate every free person from these lands." He gestured toward a collection of captured documents spread on buffalo robes before the council fire. These papers, taken from the bodies of our enemies, reveal the true scope of their conspiracy. Maps marking every water source, every river and crossing, every tribal winter camp throughout the Northern Territories. Supply lists for weapons and ammunition sufficient to arm thousands of men. Payment records showing gold flowing from sources in Washington and Chicago to fund this campaign of extermination. A murmur of anger rippled through the assembled warriors as the implications became clear. This was not random violence or opportunistic land grabbing, but a carefully orchestrated plan to seize control of the entire frontier region through systematic terrorism. Red Cloud, the legendary Oglala Sioux chief, whose own military brilliance had earned grudging respect even from his enemies, rose to address the council. "What Thunder Horse speaks is truth. My scouts have found armed white men occupying the sacred Black Hills, killing any of our people who approach the old hunting grounds. They carry papers claiming legal authority, but their authority comes only from the barrels of their guns. Spotted Tail, another prominent Sioux leader known for his diplomatic skills, nodded grimly. The reservation agents grow more demanding each week, insisting that all free bands must surrender and accept confinement on lands that cannot support our people. They speak of new laws, new requirements, new restrictions that would make us prisoners in our own country. From the Cheyenne delegation came the voice of Little Wolf, a chief whose tactical genius had frustrated cavalry commanders for decades. My warriors found white soldiers burning lodges in our winter camps, claiming they were hunting hostile war parties, but the lodges contained only women, children, and old men. This is not warfare. It is murder designed to drive us from lands our ancestors have held since time began. Sarah listened to these testimonies with growing understanding of how perfectly coordinated the conspiracy had been. Every aspect of frontier life was being systematically destroyed or corrupted, creating chaos that would justify increasingly harsh government responses. Her own trading post had been just one small piece in a vast puzzle of destruction. When Thunderhorse called upon her to address the council, Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes studying her intently. Many of these warriors had never heard a woman speak in council, but her brother's influence and her own reputation for understanding the white world had earned her this unprecedented privilege. War chiefs and brothers, she began in fluent Lakota before switching to English to ensure every delegate could understand her words. I have lived in both worlds, red and white, and I have seen how this conspiracy uses the differences between our peoples to achieve their goals. They attack white settlements and leave Sioux arrows behind. They burn tribal camps while wearing cavalry uniforms. They want all of us fighting each other while they seize the resources we are dying to protect. She moved to the collection of captured documents, pointing to specific items that supported her analysis. These supply manifests show weapons being delivered to 3 different groups. Some go to territorial militias who believe they are fighting hostile Indians. Others go to private armies who claim to be protecting settlers from savage attacks. Still others go to men like Colonel Steele, who work directly for the conspiracy while pretending to represent legitimate business interests. Maggie, assembled chiefs leaned forward, recognizing the tactical brilliance of such deception. By arming multiple sides and encouraging conflict between them, the conspiracy could eliminate opposition while remaining hidden behind the chaos they had created. Crazy Horse, the mystical war leader whose spiritual visions had guided many Sioux victories, spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the spirit world itself. The white spider weaves her web carefully, brothers. Each strand seems separate, but all connect to the center where she waits to feed on whatever becomes trapped. We must cut all the strands simultaneously if we hope to reach the spider herself. Sarah nodded, impressed by how perfectly the metaphor captured their strategic situation. The spider's center is somewhere in the territorial capital, protected by layers of legitimate authority and legal justification. But we have something they do not expect, information about their methods and unity between peoples they believe will never cooperate. Thunderhorse stood again, his presence filling the circle with renewed energy. My sister speaks wisdom. But wisdom alone will not save our people. We need a war plan that strikes at their center while protecting our families from their inevitable retaliation. From the Arapaho delegation came a suggestion that surprised everyone. Chief Little Raven, known for his preference for peaceful solutions, proposed a strategy that combined traditional warfare with modern intelligence gathering. Some of our young warriors speak English without accent and could pass for white men. In their cities, send them to gather information about the spider's web while our main forces prepare for open battle. The suggestion sparked intense debate as various chiefs weighed the risks and benefits of such espionage. Sending tribal members into white settlements was extremely dangerous, but it offered the possibility of striking at the conspiracy's leadership rather than just fighting their hired soldiers endlessly. Sarah found herself thinking of her own experience infiltrating white society, remembering how effectively she had gathered information by appearing to be something she was not. "I could return to that world," she offered quietly. "My trading post is gone, but my reputation as a businesswoman remains intact. I could investigate the conspiracy from within while you prepare the military response." The suggestion created an uproar as warriors objected to sending a woman into such danger, especially Thunder Horse's sister. But Sarah persisted, arguing that her unique background made her the perfect spy for such a mission. "They believe I am dead," she pointed out. "Colonel Steele's men reported my body burned in the trading post fire. If I appear in another territory under a different name, no one will connect me to the attacks here. I can investigate their financial networks, identify their leaders, and discover their ultimate objectives." Running Wolf, who had become Sarah's primary military instructor during her recovery, supported her proposal despite his obvious concerns. "She has learned to fight like a warrior, but more importantly, she thinks like one. Her mind is as sharp as any blade we carry, and she understands their world better than any of our other scouts." The debate continued for hours as the council wrestled with strategic decisions that would affect the fate of thousands of people across multiple territories. Gradually, consensus emerged around a two-pronged approach that would combine Sarah's intelligence mission with coordinated military strikes designed to disrupt the conspiracy's operations. Chief Gal, a Hunkpapa Sioux leader known for his aggressive tactics, outlined the military component of their strategy. While Sarah gathers information about their leaders, our war parties will begin eliminating their foot soldiers. Every raider band, every private army, every corrupt official who participates in their conspiracy must be destroyed quickly and completely. The plan that emerged from the council's deliberations was ambitious and dangerous, requiring coordination between groups that had been fighting each other for generations. But the threat they faced was unprecedented, and it demanded an unprecedented response. Sarah would travel to the territorial capital disguised as Margaret Caldwell, a wealthy widow from the east, seeking investment opportunities in frontier development. Her supposed husband's death had left her with substantial resources and a desire to honor his memory by supporting westward expansion. The identity was plausible enough to gain access to the highest levels of territorial society while providing cover for her real mission. Meanwhile, the assembled tribes would coordinate their military efforts for maximum impact. Rather than fighting separately as they had in the past, they would share intelligence, coordinate timing, and support each other's operations with the efficiency of a single, unified army. The logistical challenges were enormous. 17 different tribes speaking multiple languages and following various traditional customs had to be welded into an effective fighting force. Supply lines had to be established to provide ammunition and other modern necessities while maintaining the mobility that made Plains warriors so effective. Communication networks had to be created to coordinate operations across hundreds of miles of territory. But as the council sessions continued, Sarah watched ancient animosities dissolve in the face of common purpose. Hereditary enemies shared strategies and resources, bound together by their recognition that survival required unprecedented cooperation. Old men who had spent their lives fighting each other now planned battles alongside warriors they had once tried to kill. Thunder Horse appointed war chiefs to lead different aspects of the campaign, each chosen for specific skills that would be crucial to their success. Swift runners established communication routes between the various tribal territories. Scouts began mapping the locations of enemy strongholds and supply depots. Weapons makers increased production of arrows, lances, and other traditional armaments while adapting captured rifles for tribal use. Most importantly, spiritual leaders from all the participating tribes worked together to ensure their campaign received proper blessing from the ancestors. Sacred ceremonies were conducted to purify the warriors and ask for guidance in the battles ahead. Vision quests revealed strategic insights that influenced tactical planning. War paint and protective medicines were prepared according to ancient formulas that had protected tribal warriors for countless generations. As the Great Council drew to a close, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her intelligence mission would determine whether the military campaign could strike at the conspiracy's heart or would be forced to fight an endless series of battles against well-supplied enemies. Everything depended on her ability to penetrate the white world's secrets and return with information that could guide their strategy. The final ceremony was conducted at sunset, with all 17 tribes participating in a ritual binding that had never before been attempted. Sacred objects from each group were combined in a great medicine bundle that would accompany the war parties, symbolizing their unity of purpose. Songs were sung in languages some of the warriors had never heard before, but the meaning transcended words as voices joined together in harmony. Thunder Horse presented Sarah with her own sacred items for the mission ahead, a medicine bundle. Blessed by shamans from multiple tribes and weapons crafted by the finest artisans among their people. But the most important gift was the knowledge that thousands of warriors would be working to support her mission, ready to act on whatever intelligence she could provide. As the council dispersed and the various tribal delegations began their journeys home, Sarah prepared for her own departure. The transformation from wounded refugee to elite warrior spy was complete, but the most dangerous part of her journey lay ahead. She would be traveling alone into the heart of enemy territory, relying on her wits and training to survive among people who would kill her instantly if her true identity was discovered. But she carried with her something her enemies could never understand or defeat: the spiritual strength of her ancestors and the united will of the free peoples of the plains. The conspiracy had created their own worst nightmare by attacking Thunder Horse's sister. Now they would face the consequences of awakening a sleeping giant whose wrath would be both swift and terrible. The grand ballroom of the territorial governors. Mansion glittered with crystal chandeliers and the finest society that the frontier capital could muster. Ladies in elaborate gowns from Paris and New York mingled with gentlemen whose fortunes had been carved from the wilderness through determination, cunning, and often ruthless ambition. Among them moved Margaret Caldwell, the mysterious widow, whose arrival 3 weeks earlier had set tongues wagging throughout the territorial elite. Sarah had perfected her disguise with meticulous attention to detail. Her naturally dark hair had been lightened to auburn, using techniques learned from a French seamstress in St. Louis, while carefully applied cosmetics softened her features and concealed the small scars left by her ordeal. Her wardrobe consisted of the finest Eastern fashions, each garment selected to project wealth, sophistication, and just enough vulnerability to make powerful men eager to assist her business endeavors. The fictitious backstory she had created was both believable and strategically useful. Margaret Caldwell's late husband had supposedly been a successful railroad investor whose untimely death from typhoid had left her with substantial assets and a burning desire to honor his memory by supporting Western development. She sought investment opportunities that would bring civilization to the frontier while generating profits worthy of her husband's legacy. It was exactly the kind of story that would attract the attention of men involved in large-scale territorial development schemes. Tonight's reception was being hosted by Governor William Harrison Ashworth, a portly politician whose public image, as a champion of progress, masked more sinister ambitions. Sarah had spent weeks cultivating relationships that would earn her an invitation to this exclusive gathering, knowing that the territory's real power brokers would all be present. What she had discovered during those weeks of careful investigation had confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy she was fighting. "Mrs. Caldwell," came a cultured voice from behind her. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." Sarah turned to find herself facing a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, impeccably dressed and radiating the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command. "I am Senator Richard Blackstone, chairman of the Territorial Development Commission." Sarah curtsied gracefully, recognizing the name from documents her brother's warriors had captured. Blackstone was one of the key figures mentioned in the conspiracy's correspondence, a man whose official position provided perfect cover for coordinating the systematic destruction of independent settlements throughout the region. "Senator Blackstone," she replied, with precisely the right mixture of deference and self-assurance. "What an honor. I've heard so much about your work bringing order and prosperity to these wild territories." Her smile was warm but not flirtatious, calculated to suggest a business-minded widow rather than a woman seeking romantic attention. "Your reputation precedes you as well, Mrs. Caldwell," Blackstone replied, offering his arm to escort her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "A woman of your resources and vision could play a significant role in our plans for the territory's future. Perhaps we might discuss some investment opportunities that would interest someone of your particular background." As they walked, Sarah mentally catalogued everything she observed about the other guests. Colonel Steele stood near the refreshment table, engaged in animated conversation with several men whose military bearings suggested they held significant commands. The sight of her would-be killer moving freely among the territorial elite sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to maintain perfect composure. Her disguise had proven effective so far, but one moment of recognition would mean certain death. "I understand you're particularly interested in transportation infrastructure," Blackstone continued, guiding their conversation toward topics that revealed his own priorities. "Railroad development, river commerce, strategic road construction through previously inaccessible areas." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, playing her role perfectly. "My late husband always said that controlling transportation meant controlling everything else. A territory without proper infrastructure can never achieve its full potential." She paused meaningfully. "Of course, such development requires clearing away obstacles that might impede progress." Blackstone's eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed, Mrs. Caldwell. Obstacles such as outdated land claims, primitive settlements that block strategic locations, and populations that resist the inevitable march of civilization." His tone remained conversational, but Sarah heard the steel beneath his polished words. "How unfortunate that such resistance persists," she replied carefully. "I would have thought that reasonable people could be persuaded to embrace progress, especially when offered fair compensation for their cooperation. Unfortunately," Blackstone said with a regretful shake of his head, "some elements of frontier society prove remarkably stubborn in their attachment to obsolete ways of life. They fail to understand that individual preferences must sometimes yield to the greater good." He gestured toward a group of men gathered around Governor Ashworth. "Perhaps you'd like to meet some of my associates who share your vision for territorial development." As Blackstone led her across the ballroom, Sarah's trained eye picked out details that confirmed the intelligence she had been gathering. Maps of the territory hung on the walls, marked with symbols that corresponded to locations mentioned in captured documents. Certain areas were highlighted in red, probably indicating settlements marked for elimination. Green markings, likely, showed planned infrastructure projects that would follow once existing obstacles had been removed. The group surrounding Governor Ashworth included several familiar faces from her investigation. Judge Franklin Morrison, whose court decisions had consistently favored large development interests over individual property rights. General Marcus Wellington, the territorial military commander whose cavalry units had been remarkably ineffective at preventing raids on independent settlements. Dr. Harrison Thorne, whose position as Territorial Health Commissioner provided perfect cover for introducing diseases into tribal populations through contaminated supplies. "Gentlemen," Blackstone announced as they approached, "allow me to present Mrs. Margaret Caldwell, the railroad heiress I mentioned previously. I believe she may be interested in our upcoming ventures." Governor Ashworth's smile was as slick as his carefully oiled hair. "Mrs. Caldwell, welcome to our little gathering. I trust you're finding the territory full of opportunities for someone with your resources and vision." "Indeed, Governor," Sarah replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing servant. "Though I confess I'm somewhat concerned by reports of continued violence throughout the region. Such instability must discourage potential investors and slow the pace of development." General Wellington stepped forward, his chest decorated with medals that Sarah suspected had been earned through campaigns against defenseless populations rather than honorable military service. "I assure you, madam, that the situation is well in hand. These isolated incidents of savage violence are precisely why we need increased military presence and expanded authority to deal with hostile elements." "How reassuring," Sarah murmured, while mentally noting how perfectly their conversation revealed the conspiracy's methods. Create the violence, blame it on designated scapegoats, then use the resulting fear to justify expanded power and resources for dealing with the manufactured crisis. Dr. Thorne, a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors, added his own perspective. "The medical challenges alone require extraordinary measures, Mrs. Caldwell. These primitive populations serve as reservoirs for diseases that threaten civilized communities. Public health sometimes demands difficult decisions about quarantine and population control." Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral as she recognized the euphemisms for deliberate genocide. These men spoke of mass murder as casually as they might discuss crop rotation or livestock management, reducing human lives to obstacles in their profit calculations. "I'm curious about the timeline for your development projects," she said, probing for more specific information. "My investment advisors will want to know when they can expect to see returns on any commitments I might make." Judge Morrison consulted a pocket watch with elaborate precision. "I would say that most current obstacles should be resolved within the next 6 months, Mrs. Caldwell. The legal framework is already in place, and the necessary enforcement mechanisms are being deployed as we speak." 6 months. Sarah filed that crucial intelligence away while continuing to play her role perfectly. Whatever the conspiracy's ultimate goals, they planned to achieve them within half a year. That meant the tribal alliance would need to act much more quickly than originally planned. Colonel Steele materialized beside their group with the silent efficiency she remembered from their deadly encounter at her trading post. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he might recognize her despite her disguise, but his attention remained focused on the other men rather than the supposedly harmless widow. "Gentlemen," Steele reported quietly, "the latest phase of clearing operations has been completed successfully. 3 more strategic locations have been secured, and their previous occupants have been permanently relocated." His euphemistic language couldn't disguise the satisfaction in his voice as he described what were undoubtedly more massacres of innocent families. "Excellent progress," Governor Ashworth replied approvingly, What about the tribal situation? I understand there have been some concerning developments in the Northern Territories. Steele's expression darkened slightly. There are reports of increased activity among the Sioux bands, sir. Some of our intelligence sources suggest they may be attempting to coordinate their usual scattered raiding parties into something more organized. General Wellington dismissed this concern with a wave of his hand. Primitive savages cannot sustain coordinated military operations, Colonel. They lack the logistical capabilities, the disciplined command structure, and the technological advantages necessary for anything beyond sporadic harassment. Sarah almost smiled at the general's arrogant ignorance. If only he knew that 17 different tribes had already united under her brother's leadership, pooling their resources and knowledge to create exactly the kind of coordinated response he considered impossible. Nevertheless, Steele insisted, I recommend increasing security around our key installations and accelerating the timeline for the final phases of our operations. The longer we allow hostile elements to organize, the more difficult our ultimate objectives become to achieve. Dr. Thorne nodded agreement. From a medical perspective, delayed action only allows disease vectors to multiply and spread. Swift, comprehensive treatment is always preferable to prolonged intervention. The conversation continued for another hour as Sarah gathered invaluable intelligence about the conspiracy's structure, methods, and timeline. She learned that the territorial government was essentially controlled by a small group of Eastern investors who had purchased influence through strategic bribes and political appointments. Military commanders, judges, health officials, and territorial administrators all answered to the same hidden masters whose identities remained carefully concealed. The conspiracy's ultimate goal was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. They intended to eliminate every independent settlement, tribal community, and small-scale operation throughout the Northern Territories, clearing the way for massive development projects that would generate enormous profits for their secret backers. Railroads, mining operations, cattle ranches, and manufacturing centers would transform the entire region into an industrial empire controlled by a handful of extremely wealthy and powerful men. As the evening progressed, Sarah excused herself from the main gathering and began exploring other areas of the governor's mansion. Her cover story as a potential investor provided perfect justification for showing interest in maps, documents, and other materials related to territorial development. What she discovered in the governor's private study exceeded her most pessimistic expectations about the conspiracy's reach and resources. Detailed maps covered one entire wall, showing not just the current territory, but projected expansion into neighboring regions. Red pins marked locations where elimination operations had already been completed, while blue pins indicated targets scheduled for future action. A massive green area encompassed lands designated for the conspiracy's own development projects, representing millions of acres of some of the richest territory on the continent. Financial documents revealed the staggering sums being invested in the conspiracy's operations. Eastern banking houses, European investment syndicates, and wealthy individuals had contributed millions of dollars to fund what they clearly saw as a long-term business opportunity worth almost any cost in human lives. Most disturbing of all were the correspondence files that revealed connections reaching all the way to Washington, D.C. Senators, congressmen, cabinet members, and military commanders were all receiving payments or promises of future benefits in exchange for their cooperation. With the conspiracy's goals, the corruption reached to the highest levels of the federal government, making traditional legal challenges impossible. As Sarah photographed crucial documents using a small camera concealed in her evening bag, she heard footsteps approaching. The study. She quickly returned everything to its original position and assumed the pose of a woman admiring the territorial maps from purely aesthetic interest. "Finding everything illuminating, Mrs. Caldwell?" came Senator Blackstone's voice. From the doorway, Sarah turned with a bright smile that concealed her racing heart. Absolutely fascinating, Senator. The scope of development potential is even greater than I had imagined. She gestured toward the maps. Though I notice certain areas seem to be marked as problematic, are those regions where investment might be inadvisable? Blackstone joined her before the maps, his expression revealing nothing of any suspicions he might harbor. Those markings indicate areas where clearing operations are still in progress, Mrs. Caldwell. Within a few months, they should be perfectly safe for the kind of large-scale development projects that would interest someone of your resources. Clearing operations, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. How thorough are such operations, Senator? I would hate to invest in properties that might later be subject to conflicting claims or legal challenges. I can assure you that our clearing operations are extremely thorough, Blackstone replied with cold certainty. Once we designate an area for development, all existing obstacles are removed permanently. No claims, no challenges, no complications that might interfere with legitimate business activities. Sarah had heard enough to understand that she was standing in the heart of a conspiracy that planned genocide on an unprecedented scale. These men spoke of eliminating entire populations with the same casual efficiency they might use to discuss clearing forests or draining swamps. They saw human beings as nothing more than obstacles to be removed in pursuit of profit and power. The intelligence she had gathered would allow the tribal alliance to strike at the conspiracy's real leaders rather than just fighting their hired killers endlessly. But first, she had to escape from the governor's mansion without arousing suspicions that might compromise her mission. One wrong word or suspicious action would mean not just her own death, but the failure of her people's only chance to strike effectively at their enemies. As she prepared to make her excuses and depart, Sarah reflected on how completely the evening had exceeded her expectations. She had infiltrated the conspiracy's inner circle, identified its key leaders, and discovered its timeline and ultimate objectives. Now she had to survive long enough to get that information back to Thunder Horse and the waiting tribal armies. The real war was about to begin. And for the first time since the burning of her trading post, Sarah felt confident that her people had a real chance of victory. The telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages as Sarah's intelligence reached Thunder. Horse through a network of tribal runners who had never been detected by territorial authorities. Within hours of receiving her report, war parties from 17 different tribes launched simultaneous attacks across 3 territories, striking with the precision of a coordinated military machine that their enemies had believed impossible. Her primitive savages to achieve. Sarah herself was racing across the moonlit prairie on her fastest horse, having fled the territorial capital under cover of darkness after overhearing Colonel Steele ordering a manhunt for the mysterious Mrs. Caldwell. Her cover had been blown when a sharp-eyed clerk recognized inconsistencies in her forged financial documents, but not before she had transmitted the crucial intelligence that would guide her people's war effort. The first strikes hit at dawn, targeting the conspiracy's supply depots, communication centers, and isolated outposts with devastating effectiveness. Running Wolf led 300 Sioux warriors in a lightning assault on Fort Morrison, the heavily fortified supply base that had been funneling weapons and ammunition to Steele's raiders. The attack was over in minutes, with the fort's garrison either dead or fleeing into the wilderness, while massive stores of military equipment fell into tribal hands. Simultaneously, Crazy Horse's spiritual warriors struck the telegraph junction, a Devil's Creek, severing the main communication lines between the territorial capital and military outposts throughout the region. Without their technological advantage in rapid communication, the conspiracy's forces found themselves isolated and vulnerable to the kind of warfare that Plains tribes had perfected over centuries of conflict. Chief Gal's Hunkpapa warriors demonstrated their mastery of psychological warfare by attacking the Riverside Development Company's headquarters at precisely the moment when Senator Blackstone was scheduled to arrive for an inspection tour. The senator's private train was derailed 3 miles from the station, and when rescue parties arrived, they found only empty cars and mysterious symbols painted in war paint on the overturned locomotives. But the most spectacular strike occurred. At dawn, when Little Wolf's Cheyenne fighters overran the territorial prison where dozens of tribal leaders had been held on fabricated charges. The liberation was accomplished with such speed and stealth that guards in adjacent buildings were unaware of the assault until freed prisoners began emerging from cells that should have been securely locked. Among the liberated were several chiefs whose knowledge of the conspiracy's operations proved invaluable for planning additional attacks. Sarah reached the main tribal encampment as reports of these victories were still arriving through the runner networks. She found Thunderhorse coordinating multiple operations from a command post that rivaled anything the territorial military could establish, with maps, intelligence reports, and communication systems that kept him informed of developments across hundreds of miles of territory. "Sister," he greeted her with obvious relief, "your intelligence has given us the keys to their kingdom. Every target you identified has been struck successfully, and their entire network is collapsing faster than they can adapt to our tactics." Sarah dismounted from her exhausted horse and accepted the bowl of hot buffalo stew that Running Wolf offered. "They'll regroup quickly once they understand what they're facing," she warned between bites. "These men have resources and connections that go far beyond what we've seen so far." Governor Ashworth was expecting reinforcements from federal cavalry units, and General Wellington mentioned something about special authorization from Washington for extreme measures. Thunderhorse nodded grimly. "We anticipated their escalation. Our scouts report cavalry columns moving from 3 different directions, converging on our position with artillery and supply trains that suggest they plan a major offensive. But they still think in terms of conventional warfare against a stationary enemy." The beauty of the tribal strategy became apparent as Sarah studied the tactical maps spread across buffalo hides in the command lodge. Rather than defending fixed positions that could be surrounded and bombarded, the Allied tribes had reverted to their traditional mobile warfare tactics, enhanced by captured modern weapons and coordinated through an intelligence network that spanned the entire region. "We've divided their forces by striking simultaneously at targets they must defend," explained Red Cloud, his weathered face marked with fresh war paint. "While they gather troops to protect their remaining supply bases, our war parties are already moving to new positions for the next phase of attacks." The next phase, Sarah learned, was even more ambitious than the first. Rather than simply disrupting the conspiracy's operations, the tribal alliance planned to capture key leaders and force them to reveal the full extent of their network. Information extracted from prisoners taken during the initial raids had revealed safe houses, hidden armories, and communication codes that would allow even deeper penetration of the conspiracy's structure. But the enemy was adapting as well. As dawn broke over the encampment, scouts reported that Colonel Steele had survived the attack on Fort Morrison and was now leading a combined force of cavalry, territorial militia, and hired mercenaries in a direct assault on the tribal position. His column included several pieces of artillery and a supply train that suggested he planned a prolonged siege rather than a quick strike. "They're trying to force us into the kind of battle they understand," Thunderhorse observed, studying reports of the approaching forces. "Stand-up fighting between formations, where their superior firepower and discipline would give them the advantage." Sarah felt a chill of recognition as she realized what Steele was attempting. "He's not just trying to defeat us militarily," she said. "He's trying to create the kind of massive battle that would justify federal intervention. If he can provoke us into a large-scale engagement, Washington will send additional troops under emergency authorization. The Tribal War Council that convened immediately was unlike anything in Plains history. Chiefs who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of mobile warfare found themselves planning for a different kind of conflict, one that would determine not just the fate of their immediate families, but the survival of their entire way of life. Spotted Tail, whose diplomatic skills had kept his band from many previous conflicts, offered a perspective that surprised everyone. Perhaps we should give them the battle they seek, but not the way they expect it. Let them think they have trapped us in a defensive position while we prepare surprises they cannot anticipate. The plan that emerged combined traditional deception, tactics, with innovations made possible by captured equipment and coordinated intelligence. The main tribal encampment would appear to prepare for siege warfare, complete with defensive earthworks and visible preparations for a prolonged standoff. But these apparent preparations were actually elaborate camouflage for a completely different strategy. While Steele's forces positioned themselves for what they believed would be a conventional siege, small war parties were already moving to attack their supply lines, communication networks, and escape routes. The colonel would find himself commanding a force that was gradually being surrounded and cut off from reinforcement, even as he believed he was laying siege to a trapped enemy. Sarah volunteered for the most dangerous part of the deception, returning, to her, Margaret Caldwell identity, to infiltrate Steele's headquarters and gather intelligence about his tactical plans. The risk was enormous, since her cover had been compromised, and Steele would certainly recognize her if given the opportunity. But the information she could provide would be crucial for timing the tribal counterattacks. "You've already done more than enough," Thunderhorse protested when she outlined her proposal. "Let others take the risks while you rest and recover from your ordeal." But Sarah was adamant. "I'm the only one who can move freely in their camp." Without immediately arousing suspicions, my cover story as a wealthy widow gives me legitimate reasons to be interested in military operations, and Steele's men won't expect the same woman to resurface after fleeing the territorial capital. The disguise she adopted this time was different from her previous elegant persona. Margaret Caldwell had supposedly suffered a nervous breakdown after witnessing the violence that had consumed the territory, transforming her from a confident businesswoman into a frightened refugee seeking military protection. The change in personality would explain any nervousness or inconsistencies in her behavior, while providing perfect justification for her presence near military operations. As evening approached, Sarah rode towards Steele's encampment under a flag of truce, accompanied by 2 tribal warriors disguised as mixed-blood scouts, offering their services to the territorial forces. The deception was multi-layered and complex, with each element designed to support the others while providing fallback options if any part of the plan was discovered. Steele's headquarters had been established in a commandeered ranch house, 3 miles from the tribal position, surrounded by defensive works and guarded by sentries who were clearly nervous about their isolated position. Sarah could see why they were concerned. The surrounding hills provided perfect cover for snipers, and the single road leading to their position would become a death trap if hostile forces controlled the high ground. "Mrs. Caldwell," Steele said, when she was brought before him, his eyes sharp with suspicion despite her distressed appearance. "I understood you had departed the territory after the recent unpleasantness in the capital." Sarah allowed her voice to tremble as she responded, playing the role of a traumatized widow seeking protection. "I tried to leave, Colonel, but the roads are so dangerous now. My escort was attacked by savages just 20 miles from here, and I barely escaped with my life." She gestured toward her travel-stained clothes and disheveled appearance. "I heard. Your forces were in the area and hoped you might provide safe passage back to civilization. The colonel studied her carefully, clearly weighing his options. A wealthy widow with Eastern connections could be useful for political purposes, but she also represented a potential security risk if her true loyalties were questionable. These are dangerous times for civilian travel, Mrs. Caldwell. Perhaps it would be safer for you to remain here until we've resolved the current military situation. Military situation? Sarah asked, with carefully calculated innocence. I thought this was simply another Indian raid that would be quickly suppressed. Steele's expression darkened as he gestured toward the hills where tribal signal fires were visible in the gathering dusk. This is something entirely different, madam. We are facing a coordinated uprising involving multiple tribes and sophisticated tactics that suggest outside assistance. The savages have somehow acquired modern weapons and military intelligence that makes them far more dangerous than usual. As the conversation continued, Sarah gathered crucial details about Steele's force composition, supply situation, and tactical plans. She learned that he commanded nearly 800 men, including regular cavalry, territorial militia, and hired mercenaries from as far away as Texas and Colorado. His artillery consisted of 4 mountain howitzers and 2 field guns that could dominate any defensive position the tribes might establish. More importantly, she discovered that Steele was expecting significant reinforcements within the next 2 days. A full regiment of federal cavalry was marching from Fort Leavenworth under emergency orders, along with additional artillery and supplies that would give him overwhelming superiority in any conventional engagement. But the colonel's confidence was based on fundamental misunderstandings about his enemy's capabilities and intentions. He still thought in terms of fighting scattered bands of warriors using traditional tactics, not the coordinated military machine that Thunderhorse had created from the tribal alliance. As night fell over the encampment, Sarah excused herself to rest in the quarters that had been assigned to her, a small room in the ranch house that provided perfect observation of the headquarters' activities. Through her window, she could see the disposition of guards, the location of ammunition stores, and the communication systems that connected Steele's position with his scattered outposts. Most crucially, she overheard conversations between officers that revealed the colonel's plan for the morning assault. He intended to begin with an artillery bombardment designed to force the tribes into defensive positions, followed by coordinated cavalry charges that would break their resistance through superior firepower and disciplined tactics. What Steele didn't know was that the tribal positions he planned to bombard were already empty, evacuated hours earlier as part of Thunderhorse's deception plan. The warriors he thought he would trap were actually positioned to attack his own forces from directions he considered secure. As midnight approached, Sarah prepared to transmit her intelligence to the tribal commanders through signals that would be invisible to the enemy sentries. The real battle was about to begin, and for the first time since her trading post had been burned, she felt confident that justice would finally be served. The men who had unleashed terror across the territories were about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by enemies who showed no more mercy than they had given to innocent families. The storm that had been building since that first night of fire and betrayal was finally about to break with all the fury of the Great Plains themselves. The pre-dawn darkness shattered with the roar of artillery as Colonel Steele's forces began their assault on what they believed were entrenched tribal positions. 4 mountain howitzers and 2 field guns pounded the empty hillsides for 20 minutes, their shells exploding against rocks and trees, while the real enemy watched from concealed positions 3 miles away. The psychological effect was exactly what Thunderhorse had anticipated. Steele's men advanced with the confidence of soldiers who believed their enemy had already been broken by superior firepower. Sarah crouched in her assigned position within the ranch house, using a small mirror to flash coded signals toward the hills, where tribal spotters waited for information about the enemy's movements. Through her window, she could see Steele directing the bombardment with obvious satisfaction, convinced that his overwhelming display of force would end the uprising before his reinforcements even arrived. What the colonel couldn't see were the 800 warriors who had spent the night moving into position around his encampment. Every escape route had been quietly blocked, every high point occupied by marksmen with captured rifles, every water source and supply cache secured by small teams of specialists. The hunters had become the hunted, though they wouldn't realize it until the trap was fully sprung. The first sign that something was wrong came when Steele's scouts failed to return from their dawn reconnaissance. The colonel had sent out 6 different patrols to confirm the results of his artillery barrage, but none reported back as scheduled. Instead of the expected intelligence about tribal casualties and defensive positions, his headquarters received only silence from the surrounding countryside. "Sir," reported a nervous lieutenant, "we've lost contact with all forward units. No signals from any of the observation posts established last night." Steele frowned as he studied his tactical maps, suddenly aware that his carefully planned assault was proceeding without crucial information about enemy positions. "Send runners to re-establish contact," he ordered. "I want confirmation that our artillery achieved its objectives before we commit the main force." But the runners never returned either. They vanished into the morning mist as completely as if the earth had swallowed them, leaving Steele's headquarters increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by hundreds of armed men. The colonel's confidence began to erode as he realized that his enemy possessed capabilities he had never encountered in decades of frontier warfare. The trap was sprung at precisely 8 o'clock, when Thunder Horse's signal echoed across the hills like the voice of the storm spirits themselves. From every direction, simultaneously came the war cries of 17 different tribes, their voices blending into a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Steele's men found themselves surrounded by enemies who had materialized from the landscape itself, striking with coordinated precision that destroyed any hope of organized resistance. The artillery that had seemed so dominant moments earlier became useless as tribal warriors closed to hand-to-hand combat range, negating the advantage of superior firepower through tactics perfected over generations of plains warfare. Cavalry charges that should have scattered undisciplined raiders instead met disciplined volleys from captured rifles, fired by marksmen who had learned their trade-hunting buffalo across vast distances. But this was not a massacre in the style that Steele and his associates had inflicted on innocent settlements. Thunderhorse had given specific orders that prisoners were to be taken alive whenever possible, particularly officers who might possess valuable intelligence about the conspiracy's remaining leadership. The tribal alliance needed information more than it needed revenge, though justice would certainly be served before the day was finished. Sarah watched the battle unfold from her observation post, maintaining her cover as the frightened widow until the moment when tribal warriors stormed the ranch house itself. Only then did she throw off her disguise and emerge as the woman who had orchestrated this moment of reckoning, her grandfather's war paint marking her face in patterns that had not been seen in battle for over a generation. Colonel Steele's capture came at the hands of Running Wolf himself, the veteran warrior taking personal satisfaction in subduing the man who had burned so many innocent homes throughout the territory. The colonel fought with desperate courage, but he was facing an opponent whose skills had been honed through decades of warfare against enemies far more dangerous than corrupt territorial officials and hired killers. "You!" Steele gasped when he saw Sarah approaching, recognition finally dawning despite the war paint that transformed her appearance. "The trader woman. You should be dead." Sarah knelt beside the wounded colonel, her voice calm despite the fury that burned in her dark eyes. "Many people should be dead, Colonel. The Peterson family, the Miller children, the dozen other families you murdered to clear land for your employer's development projects. But here we are, and the dead cry out for justice." The information extracted from captured prisoners over the following hours revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had plagued the territories for months. Maps found in Steele's headquarters showed planned attacks on over 40 additional settlements, with timetables that would have eliminated every independent community within 6 months. Supply manifests revealed weapon shipments sufficient to arm thousands of mercenaries, while correspondence implicated territorial officials at the highest levels of government. Most damning of all were the financial records that traced payments, from Eastern investors directly to the men who had carried out the systematic terrorism. Bank drafts, property deeds, and investment contracts laid out a paper trail that connected wealthy industrialists in New York and Chicago to the burning of frontier cabins and the murder of innocent families. Thunder Horse convened a war council that evening to decide the fate of their prisoners and plan their next moves against the conspiracy's remaining leadership. The great chief sat in judgment with the authority of 17 united tribes behind him, his presence commanding absolute attention as he considered testimony from captured enemies and evidence gathered during months of investigation. "The white man's law has failed to protect the innocent," he declared, his voice carrying across the assembled warriors like thunder rolling across the plains. "Their courts serve only those with gold to purchase verdicts. Their soldiers protect only those who pay their wages. Justice must come from other sources when the official channels are corrupted beyond redemption." But Sarah argued for a different approach, one that would expose the conspiracy to public scrutiny rather than simply executing its agents in frontier justice. "Brother," she said, rising to address the council in both English and Lakota, "these men are only the weapons used by our real enemies. Killing them accomplishes nothing if their masters remain free to hire new killers and continue their campaign of terror." Her proposal was both audacious and carefully reasoned. Rather than executing the prisoners, the tribal alliance would escort them to the federal authorities in Kansas City, along with all the evidence they had gathered about the conspiracy's operations. The dramatic arrival of hundreds of warriors delivering captured criminals and documented proof of territorial corruption would create a sensation that could not be ignored or suppressed by local officials. The plan required precise timing and coordination to avoid being intercepted by corrupt territorial forces before reaching federal jurisdiction. But it offered the possibility of exposing the conspiracy to national attention while demonstrating that the tribal alliance was not simply a collection of savage raiders, but a legitimate government responding to systematic aggression against its people. More importantly, Sarah had identified a federal prosecutor in Kansas City whose reputation for integrity and independence made him the perfect recipient for their evidence. Judge Harrison Matthews had built his career fighting political corruption and would not be easily intimidated by the wealthy interests behind the territorial conspiracy. The journey to Kansas City took 8 days, with the tribal column moving across the prairie like a mobile city complete with prisoners, captured equipment, and hundreds of warriors serving as escorts. News of their approach spread ahead of them, creating a sensation in every settlement they passed. Many frontier communities that had lived in fear of both Indian raids and territorial corruption found themselves cheering the warriors who had finally brought the real criminals to justice. The arrival in Kansas City created exactly the kind of public spectacle that Sarah had envisioned. Thousands of citizens lined the streets as Thunderhorse led his warriors through the city, their prisoners, and captured evidence, creating undeniable proof of the conspiracy that had terrorized the frontier for months. Newspaper reporters and federal officials crowded around as boxes of documents were presented to Judge Matthews, creating a permanent record that could not be buried or forgotten. The trials that followed made national headlines as the full scope of the territorial conspiracy was revealed in open court. Testimony from captured mercenaries implicated senators, generals, and territorial officials in a scheme that had cost hundreds of innocent lives while generating enormous profits for Eastern investors. The evidence was so overwhelming that even corrupt officials could not prevent convictions and lengthy prison sentences. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the recognition of the tribal alliance as a legitimate government with the right to control its traditional territories. The federal government, embarrassed by the exposure of corruption in its territorial administration, negotiated a comprehensive treaty that granted unprecedented autonomy to the United Tribes while establishing new procedures for preventing future abuses. Sarah found herself appointed as the official liaison between the tribal government and federal authorities, a position that utilized her unique background and hard-won expertise in navigating between different worlds. Her new trading post, built with tribal labor and federal funding as part of the peace settlement, became a symbol of what could be accomplished when different peoples worked together instead of being manipulated into conflict. The site she chose for her new establishment was significant, the exact location where her original trading post had stood before Colonel Steele's raiders burned it to the ground. But this new structure was larger and more impressive than its predecessor, with defensive features that would discourage future attacks and symbolic elements that honored both her heritage and her role in bringing justice to the frontier. On the day of the grand opening, representatives from dozens of communities gathered to celebrate not just a successful business venture, but the restoration of peace and prosperity to a region that had been torn apart by greed and corruption. Thunderhorse himself participated in the dedication ceremony, blessing the new trading post as a bridge between peoples and a monument to the power of justice over tyranny. As Sarah stood on the porch of her new establishment, watching customers from various communities conduct business in harmony, she reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened woman who had been left for dead among the ashes of her first trading post had been transformed by fire and struggle into someone capable of standing between worlds and ensuring that both could thrive. The conspiracy that had sought to eliminate every independent voice in the territory had instead created its own worst enemy. By attacking Thunderhorse's sister, they had awakened a force that could not be intimidated, corrupted, or defeated through the methods they had used against weaker opponents. The raiders who had burned her cabin and left her for dead had learned too late that some fires create rather than destroy, forging new strength from the ashes of what came before. Sarah Whitefeather had found her true calling in the space between worlds, ensuring that the bridges she built would endure long after the forces that sought to destroy them had been consigned to history's judgment. The thunder of justice had spoken across the Great Plains, and its echo would continue to protect the innocent for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.